Hi, I'm Padma Mallikarjunan. I'm an enterprise support manager at AWS, and I'm based out of Austin, Texas. Welcome to AWS Knowledge Center Live, where we share best practices and troubleshooting tips from AWS Support. Joining me today is Michael Beck and Francesco Penta from AWS Support. Can you give us a quick introduction, Michael and Francesco?
Sure, Padma. Michael Beck. I've been with AWS for a few years now, and I'm an enterprise support manager in San Francisco, California.
Hi, everyone. My name is Francesco Penta. I'm a principal cloud support engineer based in Dublin, Ireland. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you for joining us today. Today, we will be introducing you to infrastructure event readiness using AWS. We will specifically focus on designing to be ready for peak traffic during your planned marketing events or a new product launch. Before we get started, a quick note to the attendees online. Please use the chat window on the right-hand side of your screen to share your thoughts and ask your questions throughout the episode. We look forward to hearing from you. Also, share with us your stories on how you have planned for peak events and large events using AWS. Michael, can you walk us through what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, thanks, Padma. So we're going to be talking about the things which are within your control leading up to a planned infrastructure event the day of and afterwards. And we're going to be talking a lot about some general design principles. We're going to touch on organizational preparedness, and then we'll wrap up covering an AWS service called Infrastructure Event Management, available to enterprise support customers as well as business support customers. And I'm going to pass it back off to Francesco, who is going to get us started.
Thanks, Michael. So the first thing I want to talk about is what we mean by a planned infrastructure event or a peak event. Normally, those are business-driven, and those big events that your organization is planning for a while and normally are related to the launch of a product or a marketing event or anything really that will drive a lot of traffic to your infrastructure, either be a website or a service or anything in between. There is a big expectation behind these events, and the reason is that it will draw a lot of attention. Again, if there is a big marketing event behind it, there will be a lot of chat and advertisement about it, and people will be drawn to your infrastructure. So you want to make sure that everything is going smoothly and there's no issues in dealing with your customers. You need to be prepared for this. So you want to be sure that your infrastructure is designed for scale and that it can sustain that level of traffic. So it's critical that everything will stay online, that will work smoothly and with fast response time for your users. Sometimes you might have planned events that are not really planned, but in general, having a good, robust design will allow also to deal with those that are unknown or unexpected, such as celebrity endorsement or a tweet that's driving more traffic to your website. So there's a couple of things that happen with prior to have a planned infrastructure event that you should be doing. There are checklists and architecture and operational readiness that you can follow to ensure that your architecture is able and capable of scaling and sustain that level of traffic, that you're using the right service that will help you cope with that amount of traffic, as well enabling you to easily manage and respond to whatever issue or incident is happening at any given time. You also might want to identify and address any bottleneck there may be in your application, either a component or a feature that doesn't really play well with the high amount of traffic or anything really that you did not anticipate. Most importantly, you want to check all the quotas and availability of resources in your AWS accounts or multiple AWS accounts if you use more than one, ensuring that if you need to launch more instances or if you need additional resources, you have the right level of quotas to launch those additional resources. As well, you want to look into expanding into additional AWS availability zones. These increase your availability as well as adding additional capacity and whenever possible, adding additional regions as well, allowing you to be closer to your customer if it makes sense with your platform. But this is the general concept and ideas. Basically, you want to be prepared. And might seem a bit complicated, but there's always help. So there's a couple of things I want to discuss specific about the general design principles. But before we go into that, Padma, is there any question from the audience?
I did not see any questions from the audience as of yet. Everyone, please feel free to post your questions online. I will also continuously share links to useful reference materials. But before we get started, Francesco, I have a question for you. Can you expand a little bit more on how we can check on quotas and availability of resources on the AWS environment?
Absolutely. So every AWS account has default quotas. Normally, those are in place to avoid you spending more resources than intended and to contain the usage of those resources in your account. You can request increases for some of the quotas, and there is a specific service called Service Quotas that allows you to manage and see what are the amount of resources that you can launch in specific services for around 100 AWS services. So you can go in there from the console or the and look at the whatever quotas you might be reaching and ensuring that you have enough. In any case, when preparing and having an idea of how many of those resources you can have, if you see that you do not have enough in your quotas, you can use the service or contact support to ask for an increase of those quotas, allowing you to have the appropriate number of resources needed to handle those peak events.
Thank you, Francesco. Over to you.
Okay, perfect. So we say that this can seems like a lot of daunting tasks. You need to prepare. There are a lot of moving pieces. You need to cater for your infrastructure and your application while thinking about the architecture as well. What I want to talk about are the general design principles. This is the base foundation to design the cloud that is defined by the well-architected framework. We'll post the link in the chat, and that helps you use those principles to ensure that you are following and using the right things when building your application in the cloud. Those concepts are not AWS specific, but they do act well in a cloud environment where you have a lot of automation. Ideally, you could do this in your own data center, given the effort and the tooling and virtualizing your infrastructure, but obviously they are best applied when those things are already in place. The first thing that I want to talk about is the be flexible and remove bottlenecks principle. The first thing we want to do is that you want to identify what are the bottlenecks and break down your application to be modular. You want to move away from those monolithic architecture where everything is running on the same server for a number of reasons. The first one is that allows you to be a bit more flexible when you need to scale. If you find out that your database is a bottleneck, you can scale out your database. If you find out that your authentication system is acting as a bottleneck, you can scale that independently without having to spin unnecessary resources when things are going well in the other departments. It also makes it a bit easier to follow the principle of using services and not servers. And when you're using services, you might find that, and we'll talk a bit about this in more detail, you might find that you can offload some of your work to services that offer that. You might want to use Aurora serverless for your database needs, so that you don't have to think about managing your database. You don't want to think about patching and resources, so you just have a database that works. And as well, you can use Cognito to handle your authentication. So those are additional elements where you don't need to think about scale, you don't need to think about maintaining it, making it a bit easier. And whenever possible, you might want to leverage auto-scaling. One of the critical things that we talk with our customers is the issue they have when planning for those events. If you are in a traditional data center, you might need to order servers or allocate capacity to this event. And if you guess wrong, then you're left with a lot of unused resources. And in the worst case, if you have too little, then you have an unsuccessful event. Having the ability of scaling resources as they are needed allows you to basically just use what you need without wasting resources and not having any issues if you do not have too many. So if you guess wrong. So this is important. You want to do that, but there's a lot of guesswork. So there's another thing that you can do, and I would like Michael to talk about this. So Michael, can you tell us a bit about how you can test your systems and how you can ensure that you have the right level of capacity?
Definitely, Francesco. So as he was mentioning, it is important to test these systems at production scale. This was one of the biggest challenges that I had in managing infrastructure on-premise and in colos, was having the sufficient architecture and infrastructure that mimicked my production workload. And so what a lot of organizations do is they'll take a subset. So for example, if your traffic is 100 million hits and you've got 1,000 servers, you might test that with only 10% and try for it to be representative. The challenge that you have when you do that type of a scaled down testing is not really exercising and finding the limits and the bounds of your various services and the infrastructure. So for example, with your SaaS providers or any other third-party vendors or interconnects. And so with using the cloud, it's much easier to be able to simply spin up another replica of your infrastructure that represents your production environment, test it at scale, and then spin it down. You can do this very quickly, very efficiently, very cost effectively. So I definitely recommend testing your systems at production scale. And one of the things that helps with that is automation. So I highly recommend that you hold your infrastructure to the same standards as you do for your code and your applications. And that means versioning it. So you have what it is today and you want to implement some kind of a new change, or in this case, we're talking about being able to test your production load. It's very easy to do that. You could check out whatever your current production version is and deploy that into the test environment. And this allows you to be able to have that reproduction ability or reproducibility that enables you to do it over and over again to make sure you have everything is consistent. And you can then also make small changes. And if you have your environment properly instrumented and well logged, then you can do very finite A/B types of testing when you go through and make these changes. So you can see, oh, this is 1.2b versus 1.2c, and look and see, compare them to each other and say, okay, this change was really great. This one, maybe not so much. It needs some little bit of work. So I highly recommend automating that infrastructure. And what this enables you to do, it unlocks the concept of evolutionary architectures, because your architecture needs to be able to grow and change and evolve with your business. It's one thing to go in and spend months looking to design this ideal reference architecture, and then you launch it, and then something comes along and you need to change it. So having something that is flexible and allows you to deploy frequently and rapidly and to be able to test it in that same way is a huge benefit. And it takes a lot of stress off of the developers and your infrastructure engineers by being able to do stuff like A/B testing or blue-green deployments, where you might have something like your blue environment, which is sending 100% of the traffic. You've got your next version, which you deploy to green, and maybe you just send 1% of the traffic there, and then you slowly scale or feather it between the two. And if you have any kind of issues, it's easy to roll that back and feather that traffic back from the new green to the old blue. And then the last thing I want to touch on here is that you want to make and encourage experimentation. The idea that failure will happen and that you should reward risk. When you do something 100 times, you might find 97 ways not to do it and 3 ways in which you can and that are best and successful. So reward and encourage that type of outlook and activity and passion among your developers and engineers. So before we go any further, I want to bring Padma back in and ask her if we have any questions from the audience.
We do have some questions from the audience. Thank you, Michael. So the first question here is from Mr. Builder 10. Thank you for your question. Is using the well-architected tool a requirement for AWS customers? Um, the well-architected tool is available there to help you to review your workloads and to compare them with the current best practices, our latest that we have learned from reviewing thousands of architectures of our customers. It's not a requirement, but it's something that customers have used and they have benefited a lot. Would you like to add something to that, Michael or Francisco?
Yeah, I will start with taking that. It is really good to do the well-architected tool, and that is there to, for you to do on your own. But then it does enable us to partner with you on those findings. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit later when we talk about the AWS Infrastructure Event Management service. But it's always a good idea to know where your architecture currently stands and constantly review it. So the one comment I'll just make on that is keep it up to date. It's great to use it and to be, whether it's for your initial deployment or you have a planned infrastructure event, and so you think, oh, I need to go back and update that. I would definitely recommend doing that. Francesco, do you have any ideas or comments about that?
Yes, thanks, Michael and Padma. It's definitely a very useful tool. We've seen a lot of customers moving to AWS just either by lift and shift or moving whatever they had previously onto the cloud, and then starting running into operational issues because they were not leveraging the best practices of the cloud. And I found out that using the well-architected tool is a great tool and framework to help them identify areas of improvement as well for existing architectures. So as Michael was saying, it is something that you need to keep up to date, especially if you're following the principles and evolving your architecture with your business needs. This is something that will change over time, either because there are different needs from the business or because there are new services that allows you to do things in a easier and seamless way. But also, it's just a great tool to start using. We ask our customers a lot if they have done a well-architected review when starting looking at their infrastructure, just because it's not something special. It's just a strong framework to ask the right question, ensure that things are being done following best practices, and allows you to have a good look into what you built in your AWS accounts. It's just, sometimes you might not even think about certain things unless they become a problem. This allows you to look around the corner and anticipate some of the problems they might have by not having an optimal architecture.
Thank you. I have two more questions here, both of them from Stairway to Heaven 25. Thank you for your question. So the first question here is moving away from monolith always good? Before I turn it over to Michael and Francisco, let me add that a lot of times your business need will drive exactly where you want to be with your environment. And a business need will drive how you want to migrate to AWS as well. A lot of customers choose AWS lift and shift, while other customers choose modernizing while they migrate to AWS using our suite of serverless products. Michael, anything you want to add to that?
Now, that's a really good point, Padma, is you do have to look at what your business needs are. And, why did you do that? A lot of times we have monoliths because we built it that way, and that's where it came from. It was maybe easier for us to do so. But very often, by being able to decompose those monoliths into microservices, which are individually scalable, provides a lot of benefit. But that's not to say that microservice is the one and only design. There's a lot of flavors between monolith and microservice, and a lot of variations on the play. And you might have to take certain things into account, such as extremely low latency applications or services, and it might be easier to package some kind of monolithic application container that you can deploy as close to the edge and your customers as possible. So it's just something you need to consider and take into evaluation. Francesco.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. In general, monolith applications are more difficult to scale. You have to scale anything that might be a bottleneck, especially when everything is running on the same container or server or instance. It's just more difficult. It's though easier to deploy, it's easier to maintain in certain cases. So there are trade-offs in everything. But for the specific, I don't think we ever seen a monolithic web application scale well in the history. There might be exception, obviously. And again, as Michael was saying, you might have use cases where you want to keep components as close as together. But even in that case, you will never have everything running, especially if you have latency requirements. You do not want to run your authentication systems, and you don't want to run everything else that is not for that specific purpose. So there's always a good benefit in trying to decouple. You can still run everything on the same instance, for example, but you have the ability of decoupling when needed. And again, it greatly depends on the business needs and the specific use cases where it might make more sense to run everything together.
Good discussion. Thank you for that question, Stairway to Heaven 25. I do have one last question. Is controlling traffic in the BG deployment possible in something like AWS Code Pipeline? So to rephrase it, does AWS Code Pipeline support controlling traffic in a blue-green deployment?
Yes, so you will have to use something like Code Deploy for the deployment and managing that. And it does integrate with Code Pipeline as well as part of the code suite. But there's definitely, it's not the only service that you can use to do BG deployments. There's other services that offers this capability built in, and there's also custom way of doing it depending on what are your needs and what you need to do. I'll post a couple of links in the chat regarding a few things that you can follow up for BG deployments in AWS. But thanks for the question. It's definitely something you can do using the code suite from AWS.
Thank you. Thank you for the great questions. A lot of good discussion out of that. And also, please share your stories on how you have planned for peak traffic and for large events using AWS. We look forward to hearing your stories. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Padma. And Francesco, can you talk to us about driving our architectures using data?
Absolutely, and with pleasure. So one thing that I cannot stress enough is that you want to have as much data as possible from both your application and the infrastructure running your application. This allows you to use the data to inform if your architecture choices are working, what are bottlenecks, what are issues with specific components, and quickly intervene in case there is something that's either not performing as needed, but also use this data to forecast what you will need in the future. You might find out that even during your peak, you had a lot of resources that were not really utilized. And those idle resources, you don't really need it. They don't need to be always on. Again, as we said, you can leverage auto-scaling and serverless services to avoid incurring costs that your organization doesn't need. And it simply it makes you faster to react to problem, allows you to take better decision when building out the next version, but also helps you identify potential issues with a new version. As we said, if you're collecting the data and you're doing a blue-green deployment, and then you realize that with the new version, things are looking great, but you suddenly have 50% more resource utilization, then there might still be something wrong, even if the customers are not seeing any error. And you want to look into those improvements and efficiency so that you can simply use less resources while offering those capabilities. And sometimes you might have bugs, or you might have inefficiencies that you're not even aware of until you start testing things. And that goes back to the test system at production scale. A single user might not trigger that race condition that's making you use more and more resources until you reach a certain point. And you want to keep an eye on that, and that's why it's really important to collect the data around that. That's not the only way you can do things. So the one of the things that I love the most is the last one, which is the improve through game days. A game day is something super fun. If you had the chance of participating to one, please share your story. Normally run those events at the events like reInvent and the other meetup and to the in the AWS pop-up loft. But those are events where people will start poking around your infrastructure. So you can tell people to start deleting a certain resource and or start trying to figure out what happens if you block access to a specific component. You'll be doing this with a replica version of your infrastructure, so that you are not bringing any operational issues into your customer base, but allows you to understand where are your single point of failures. For example, you know that you might have a caching instance, and if you block access to it, then all your website is failing. And that allows you to understand that you have a single point of failure in that specific area, and to modify that. There are a lot of tools that you can use. We announced at reInvent a new tool. We'll post the link in the chat that allows you to basically design for failure, and by introducing failure in your environment and realizing how your application reacts to that, basically making this more resilient. And you might realize that you need that additional instance, or you need that additional piece of or component in your infrastructure to allow you to work smoothly if something happens in that specific moment. So last thing that I wanted to talk about is how we can put everything together. So what we talked about. Before we go and talk about the what you can do from an organization point of view, just want to help you place everything together. In any case, there's a lot of architectural reference that you can use, white papers that you can leverage to try to have the best architecture possible for your specific application. For business and enterprise customer as well, you can ask support if you have doubts on how to build your application to be resilient and highly scalable. But you're not alone in building a big application. So if we look at this sample application that we have here, this is nothing in particular, something that we have used to show how you can grow and how you can follow the design principles to build something that's a bit resilient. So when we're talking about stop guessing your capacity needs, you want to use on-demand services that allows you to grow organically. If we started from a singular instance in a single availability zone, we can start adding an auto-scaling group that spans multiple availability zones, and then add an application load balancer in front of it to balance loads. You can then start using your evolutionary architecture principle by adding a lambda that maybe just serves some pages or some part of your application, using DynamoDB to store the data. And then you suddenly realize that you don't really want to keep that login authorization mechanism. So you can start using Amazon Cognito built in your application load balancer, further offloading load from your instances. When you're then going at scale, you can start using CloudFront, using a bit of Lambda at edge to serve content faster, closer to your users, and then the web application firewall to protect yourself around undesired requests and blocking everything that is not really traffic meant for your website. Everything is backed by CloudFormation. So when we are building these, we are not going to the console and creating resources manually, but rather defining these through one or more CloudFormation templates. So if we want to replicate these or test new things out, we don't have to do everything from scratch. We simply can run another stack and then have an identical version of our infrastructure to play or experiment with. Same thing, everything is integrated with CloudWatch and sending data to either Athena or QuickSight so that we can collect logs and use that to analyze and basically drive our architecture using data. It allows you to collect all data in a centralized place, and you can create both your business dashboards or your queries to extract what was happening at a specific moment, not having to worry too much about going into a single instance and trying to collect the data and seeing what happened. And since every service integrates with CloudWatch logs and the CloudWatch metrics, it makes it easier to monitor from a single point of view. So just an idea how those design principles translate to reality and allows you to grow your architecture organically. Before we move to the next portion, is there any question, Padma?
Hi, Francesco. Thank you. There are no questions on the chat window. Thank you for showing us the architecture. Just to highlight to Stairway to Heaven 25, this architecture is also an example for a follow-up to the other question you were asking. This is built based upon the AWS well-architected principles. This is an architecture that shows resilience. How do you build this efficient infrastructure based on security and reliability and all of that? So as you go through those articles, you would see how all of this come into play. I do have a question for you, Francesco. Can you give me an example of what a game day is?
Sure, absolutely. I give an example of a game day that we run, which is the Unicorn Rentals. You'll find more information on the game day page. But what happens here is that participants will have their own AWS account where they are put in a situation where they know really little. So the previous administrator left the company, and now they have to fix problems as they're happening. This is an interactive experiment where the organizer will start breaking things here and there to see how you can react and how you can fix those issues as soon as possible, so that you can learn a bit more around operations and how to react to incidents and so on. It's a great way to teach those concepts because you are competing against other teams for points. So the team that keeps the infrastructure on for the most time is the successful team, the team that scores more. But it's also, again, it's a really fun place to learn how to react to incidents and how architecture can be made more resilient. Now you can avoid those mistakes. You're not limited to these. When you were talking about running game days in your company, normally we refer into doing these on your own architecture and infrastructure by, again, either trying to figure out what happens if something breaks, or how does your service react to a change or to loss of traffic and so on. But that's basically done to learn more and more about your architecture and what happens when trouble arises. So if trouble arises, you know exactly what to do, and you're not facing the problem for the first time because your team has already had some experience in fixing it.
Thank you, Francesco. And everyone, please keep posting your questions and share us your stories about scaling for infrastructure events using AWS. Back to you.
So thanks. Now, one thing that we spoke about is everything that goes in preparing your infrastructure and architecture. This is something that you will do even if you do not have an event. You want to ensure that your architecture is able to deal with traffic and working well, and it's built in a resilient way. You do need to, when preparing for those events, you need to ensure that your people and processes are up to date and you know what to do if something unexpected happens. So the first thing we say, you're collecting data, it's already there. If you're following all the principles, you want to have your monitoring and notification set up. First, determine what are the KPIs that are important to your infrastructure and your customers, and then you can have dashboard metrics and alarms to react to that. So if something starts looking a bit outside the norm, you can have people paged and ready to investigate. You want to have a communication plan. Who's responsible for watching over? Do you have people on call that can be brought in if something is happening? Is there an escalation path? Not everyone might be able to know everything about your infrastructure. Maybe your database team needs to be involved. You want to have a clear escalation if you're using a third-party services. What happens if things are not looking right there? As well, how you're contacting a premium support if you need assistance when something is happening. But even if you just have questions or something is not really looking right, you don't want to have that become a problem and have to that happening, so be too late for you to intervene. You also want a contingency plan. You might have something that's really unexpected, even if you prepared really well, even if you had everything in place, you run your game days, then maybe there's that combination of orders or commands a user is making, or there's simply something that you did not anticipate that's making your application not performing too well. So in that case, what do? You want to have how you're failing, basically. So are you trying to divert some of the traffic? Are you trying to throttle a bit the users and slowing them down? Are you introducing a queue? You need to have a plan to determine what happens if your infrastructure is not, if something unexpected is happening to your infrastructure. You might also have, if you're running multi-region, you might have a warm standby somewhere else, so you might want think about moving traffic. But ideally, you just have to have a solid decision beforehand and before something happens, so that you're not scrambling or for a decision or taking trying to reach out someone that can take a decision while those things are happening. It's very important to be prepared. Now, we can help you with that. And one thing I want to ask Michael is talking a bit about the infrastructure event management that we offered to help you put everything together and go through one of those events as smoothly as possible. Before we do that, just want to ask Padma, is there any question? And then we'll move to the next section.
Thank you, Francesco. Yes, we have one more question. Thank you again, Stairway to Heaven 25. A lot of great questions today. The question here is, how do you control access to AWS Cloud Formation templates? You have a specific scenario where they are all in the same AWS account. You have multiple developers having access to them. Your question is, should you write an abstraction app on top of Cloud Formation? So let me quickly point you to AWS Identity and Access Management. It's our IAM service. This service integrates with all of our AWS services. It's specifically designed to manage access to AWS services and resources securely. You can create users and groups and assign permissions to them. You can also create roles and specify the permissions that each service can use to access your resources. So how do you tie this with the Cloud Formation? You can create those IAM users or groups and assign the policies where you can allow or deny permissions for the users in your account to use Cloud Formation if they want to say view a stack, delete a stack, or execute the stack. I will post a link to it as well over here. And before that, Francesco, do you want to add something else?
Yes, so there's a few other things that you can do. We said before that you want to treat your infrastructure as code. The CloudFormation is a great way of doing it, but we also offer something that might be a bit closer to your developers, which is the CDK or Cloud Development Kit that allows you to define, and I just posted a link there, allows you to define your infrastructure as proper code. It's backed by CloudFormation in any case, but if you have any code repository, this can be used to to first ensure that whenever you're making a change, and you can do this with Cloud Formation templates as well, just for your information. But when you're doing a change, this change should be reviewed by someone, so that you can ensure that things are being done properly and then deployed. Similar to what you will do with a code review or with your standard code practices, and then going through, if you have multiple accounts, your staging account, and then all the way to production. There are different strategies. Every team uses their different strategy, and it really depends on what they are using at the moment. So I would suggest to try to figure out what your team is currently using and how that can be used with those technologies to ensure that you have a controlled environment when deploying those changes. There's a lot of instruments. It's the same as well with the code deployment and code pipeline that you can leverage to do those things. But again, every customer will use a different approach depending on what they are already using. But there are definitely ways to do this, and I would suggest to treat it as code, have your code reviews, and then when validated and tested, progress through different stages in your accounts.
Thank you, Francesco. So back to you, Michael. Talk about the IEM in our 15 minutes that we have. Go ahead.
All right, great. Thanks, Padma. So yeah, AWS Infrastructure Management. This is a service offered by AWS free of charge to enterprise support customers and available for a fee to business support customers. And this is a great way for AWS to help you in your planning and executing for these infrastructure events. So I'm just going to briefly touch on to this slide here, because these 4 phases I will step through next. So we've got our initiate, seems pretty self-explanatory. We have our plan, execute, and review. So one of the things you will notice on here that I definitely want to call out is 6 to 8 weeks of lead time for that plan phase. And the reason for this is, just like Francesco mentioned earlier, that you might have gone through and done a bunch of your own planning and testing in advance. Sometimes unforeseen things just come up. And one of the things that we do in AWS Support as part of the IEM is help to ensure that we sand away all of those rough edges as much as possible. And that's going to start with that initiate. So the way that we can do our best is if you give us that lead time. So that's where that request comes in. And then we will begin to work with you to pull together all of the artifacts that are necessary to successfully execute on an IEM. So for example, this starts off with the planning workbook. This is where we're going to work with you as the technical account manager to ensure that we have all of your architecture and your workloads and use cases properly documented so that we understand what's in scope for this large event that will be coming up, so that we can help you ensure that everything is lined up and ready to go and prepared to be tested. So Francesco mentioned earlier about service quotas. That's something that's really important when we're talking about these types of events, where you might be expecting double or triple or maybe 10 times your normal daily traffic for one of these large scale events. And as such, you're going to have to increase these service quotas. And then we also have the well-architected review, which we talked about earlier, using that well-architected tool. And we also talked earlier about capacity review, the risk and readiness assessments. And Francesco just started to touch on a little bit in his last slide and in the organizational preparedness, kind of the umbrella topic of runbooks. And that's where you have all of these different parameters defined. For example, what is the duration of your event? How is it going to start? Is there something that needs to be initiated? Maybe something that needs to get pushed out? What does the course of the event look like? Is that something that, based off of certain parameters or metrics, is there a certain type of a response? Does somebody need to do something? If there is an issue, who do you escalate to, either internally or externally with your partners or your other vendors? And then dashboards, and finally that load test. A lot of these are topics we've already talked about. So if you're doing these things as part of your regular everyday operations, then that's great. But we are here to help you ensure that all of these things get done, and we go through them in a very organized fashion. So one thing I'm going to bring up is there was a comment in the chat there about the technical account manager, or the TAM. Who is that? What is that? So that is an entitlement that comes with enterprise support. So effectively our top tier of AWS support. You have your free, you've got developer, you've got business, and then you've got enterprise support. So there's a lot of different entitlements and benefits that you get free of cost as part of having enterprise support. And that TAM, or technical account manager, is one of them. They put on a multitude of roles, and I won't get too much deeper into it, but they're somebody who's there to go along with you day in and day out. But if you have an IEM, so let's say you're doing business support, a TAM will get assigned to you to go through the IEM with you side by side. So thank you for asking about that. Sorry we don't have more time to get into it. That is the area that I work in, is TAMs and enterprise support. So I get excited, I could talk on forever, but I'm not. I'm going to stick to our topic at hand, which is handling these large infrastructure events and having readiness. So we're going to get to execute, and that is the day of, the big day. We've been working for this for the last couple of months for this big event and activity that's going to happen. And remember that AWS support is going to be there by your side through this whole thing. That same 24/7, 365 support which you have access to. You have phone, email, chat options, but also you'll have that TAM, which I was just describing a moment ago, who will there be in that war room with you physically or virtually on the conference call, or maybe in instant messaging, or in whatever way you have set up, to be able to identify issues immediately and help escalate them and address them on your behalf in real time. So finally, the last part of the infrastructure event management is going to be the review. We've initiated, we've planned, we've executed, hopefully very, very successfully. And so now we have our review. The end isn't just delivering and executing on the event, because you want to look at all of those metrics and those logs, which Francesco was talking about ensuring that you have earlier on, because it's not just for seeing how things are going in the moment, but it also enables you to look back at it. How well did it go in the comfort of the action of the time for the days and weeks afterwards? So you can look at how everything scaled, what the performance looked like. Did it meet your expectations? Were there things that you didn't think were going to happen and did? And what did those look like? So you're going to have those. Your TAM is going to pull a lot of metrics and data as well that they have access to on their side, and give you suggestions as to how that could have maybe gone better if something did crop up, some kind of an issue or challenge reared its head. But also maybe just how it could go better in the future, maybe even a little few tweaks and tuning that can be done for your everyday production environment. And one of the last things you want to do after that peak event has happened is you want to scale back that infrastructure, because if you had done, say, some pre-warming of, say, ALBs or your RDS instances or your EC2 instances, and had done some scaling up in advance and that, what we call that pre-warming, to be able to handle that large crush of traffic, which you're going to have for that really great successful event, you want to go ahead and scale those back down. Because that's one of the great things about the elasticity of working in the cloud, is that availability to not only instantly or quickly scale up, but to just as instantly or quickly scale back down again, which saves you money and makes a smaller footprint of an infrastructure to run when you don't need it. So at that, we're pretty much at the end. I want to go ahead and bring Padma back in and see, do we have any other questions that we have before we end?
Thank you, Michael. Great walkthrough of the infrastructure event management. I think we did address all the questions in the chat window. We do have a couple of minutes here. I wanted to see if you had an example, a customer example, case study example that you could share on how customers are using infrastructure event management.
Definitely. So I can talk about one that I was involved in with a customer last year, and that customer, Human, and with a E. And what they were part of was a Super Bowl halftime show and a commercial. We all love those commercials, right? That's why a lot of us watch it. That's why I watch it. I love the games as well. But they had the need for, when this commercial aired, to scale up and to be able to handle this huge influx. And so they engaged AWS Enterprise Support and Infrastructure Event Management to help them prepare and deliver for that. And even though they had been working on that for months leading up to the big day, we were still able to help them to identify some of those service quota limits we were talking about earlier, and a couple of areas of opportunities for performance improvements and enhancements. And we were able to help them deliver just a very successful IEM and large event for them.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Everything about the infrastructure event management, Francisco and Michael, and everyone, thank you for joining us today. We looked at designing to be ready for peak traffic during marketing events or a new product launch. If there were any questions that were not answered today, please post your questions on forums.aws.amazon.com or email us any feedback to kc-live@amazon.com. We want to hear from you. And also tell us what other topics you would like to see on the show. Thank you for joining us today at AWS Knowledge Center Live. Happy cloud computing.
Thank you for joining. Happy cloud computing. Bye.
Happy cloud computing.